The next video or so is going to deal with navigation. We're going to start just talking about simple navigation like you see here, and then we'll get into multi-state image-based buttons that use image sprites, and I'll explain what all that means a little bit later on. But for right now, what I have here is this site that I've been working on just to show these fluid grids, how they change based on, if you're going from a desktop computer to a pad to a phone. The problem right now, aside from the fact that this looks very ugly because I put all these colors in here so that we can see how everything works, but this navigation looks okay other than the colors. But there is a problem with it. When you get down to a size that there's no longer room for all three buttons to show, this one tucks under here and looks very, even if the colors were perfect, this looks bad. This is not an ideal situation. So I could probably go in and monkey around enough with the CSS and find a way to make that avoid happening. But there's another thing that we should explore here, and that is using images for the buttons. And if we use images for the buttons, we can make it so that they'll just pop down like any other images would. And so that's eventually what we're going to get into, but I just want to explain first how this one works and some basics about navigation. So let's go into Dreamweaver. So the first thing I want to show you is just how I created this type of navigation, just in case you need some simple navigation like this. So if I go over to the code here, you can see that the navigation is just simply, here, I just adjusted that view a little bit better so we can see all of it. So this entire chunk is my navigation, and that's inside of the div for the header. So there's the start of the header div, there's the end of the header div, and that's part of that fluid grid layout. So the best practice these days is to put your navigation inside of an ordered list, which normally, as you recall, an ordered list comes up with little bullets, or an unordered list, I'm sorry, comes up with little bullets next to it. But we get rid of that using some CSS. So let's take a look at the CSS for this. Okay, so the nav list has a clear property on it first. That's what keeps it from floating up to just to the right of that image that I have in the navigation bar, because that had a float on it, so we had to clear the float. You can ignore this. This I did not have to use, so I commented that out. And so what this is saying right here is that I have a class named navList, just like you saw in the HTML, and then this is what's known as a compound selector. So it's saying that any link inside of navList, but it's not just saying any link, it's actually saying the hover state of the link. So remember, A is for a link, but :hover is that pseudo class selector. So it selects when the mouse goes over it. So it's telling it to change the color, which means the color of the type to green and the font style to italic. Then it says any unordered list, there only happens to be one, inside of the class of nav_list, make the background color magenta, and give the padding on the top and the padding on the bottom of 1em. And then it says the list items, display those in line. So that's why we're not seeing those in a normal list from top to bottom. We're seeing them from left to right. Then we're telling the text decoration to be none. That's how you get rid of the underline. And I think that's not a recommendation, but a requirement of this current project that you're working on, not to have the navigation underlined. It's saying to make the color of the text white, the weight bold. And then here's how I got that little line to show up. It says border right. Now, normally a border goes all the way around something, right? Makes a square box around it, a border, but you can specify just a border of right, and there's a 2 pixel solid white bar for the border. And then there's a padding in those list items of 1 em on the top, and then 2 ems on the right, em on the bottom, 2 ems on the left. So that's how you get that nice consistent space in there. And one of the worst things you can do with a button is try to make all your buttons the same size and put different lengths of text in there, because that usually looks bad. And then we have the, yeah, this accidentally got doubled in here. You saw that earlier, so let me just delete that one. Okay. And then nav list current, that's when you're on the current page and it turns it yellow. So let's just take another quick look at this before we move on. So here it is in a browser, and there's the hover turns green. This is the current one, so it's yellow. So if I click on the home, we go to the home page, that turns yellow, unclickable. Same thing in the content page. And that was done. Once again, if we go back to the source code, you can see on the home page, we just put a dummy link in there rather than actually telling it to go somewhere. The pound is the dummy link, and then the class is current. And if we went to the gallery page, those two things would be flip-flop. We'd now have a normal link for the home page, but the gallery would just have a pound sign in it, and its class would be current. So now that you know how to do that, let's move on to this image-based navigation. So here's a little experiment that I did with the button. So we were looking at this inside of a browser. You've probably seen buttons like this that look, you know, they have like a little bit of white above them to make it look like they have a little bit of dimensionality to them. And when you hover over them, the button maybe changes to looks like it's depressed in or something like that. What usually happens with those in the older days was it would be one image was there, and then as soon as you hovered over it, it would replace another image with it. Then you'd get another image when you actually clicked it down. The problem with that is you have all these requests going back to the server for different images, and the trend lately has been to make one image, and then when you hover over it, you use CSS to change the position, and that's exactly what's happening up here. This image, this entire image is actually located up here, but we use CSS to say just show this much of it, and then when the hover state calls up, it says now move the image over so many pixels, or in this case I just use center. And then if I actually had a page that this would take us to, then the current state would bring this state of the button in. Okay, so here's what some of these buttons look like in action. This again is just an experiment. It's not made to be aesthetically thing. You definitely wouldn't use different colored buttons within the same navigation system. You know, it'd be more like this with these just having different names on them. But just so you can see some different kind of experiments here, let me actually just go to this page to show you. So this particular button, the way I set it up is that in its regular state, it looks like it has just a little bit of dimension to it. When you hover the button over it, the dimension becomes accented a little bit, almost like it comes more into focus. And when you click down, it looks like it is depressed inwards. This one, actually, I would probably redo it before I would use a button like this because it doesn't really have quite enough, you know, information there because it's so dark. But when you hover over it, much like the other one, looks like you can see a little bit more focus of it. When you click on it, it looks like it's depressed a little bit. And then this one, I made it so that it sticks out a little bit, has a little bit of dimension to it. And when you hover the mouse over it, it looks like it's getting depressed in a little bit. But when you actually click on it, then it looks like it's depressed in even further. So what I want to do is take you through the process of first making these in Photoshop and then writing the CSS to make it work. So we'll make 3 buttons. We'll make a home, a gallery and a contact button. And why don't we'll do this style right here. So the first thing we want to do is open up Photoshop, and then we need to create a new document for our button sprite. So we're going to go File, New, and then we have to just guess at a size at first when we go in here. Now, so what I'm going to do in this demo is I'm going to make my text 18 pixels tall. So all I can do, let's just guess at 100 here for the width. The height, if it's 18 pixels tall, let's say that it's probably going to at least be that we're going to need 25 pixels. So make sure you're working in pixels here. You can change this via the drop down. Resolution will be 72 for a regular website. Color mode you do on RGB. And background contents, let's make that transparent. And because we're going to round the corners on this and we don't want to see a color behind it. So we're going to change probably the height and width for sure later on, but we don't have to worry about that right now. We click OK, and when the new image opens up here, then we are going to start working on it. So I'm going to double click on the hand tool here to bring that into view, and I'm going to grab the text tool from here. Just click on that to select it, and then click into my canvas so that I can use it. And the computer's run a little sluggish because I have this recording program going on. So what I want to do, as soon as I click there, get the cursor, I'm ready to type, but I need to select my font and the size. So you have to make a decision here as a designer, what typeface am I going to use? So you want to either use the exact same thing you're using on your website or one that's very contrasting to it, like maybe a serif and a sans serif typeface. Probably good choices that most people have would be Verdana, Georgia. You can use Helvetica because if you're just using a font stack as opposed to providing your own fonts, then people that don't have Helvetica, their computer would use, if you set up the font stack correctly, would use Arial, which they look pretty darn close. So for this demo, I'm going to go with Helvetica. So you just use the drop down, scroll till you find the typeface you want to use, what cut of it, regular, bold, italic, and then the size. So I'm going to go with 18 for this demo. So I'm going to type in the word home for the button. Now, as a designer, I have to be very mindful of how much space I want above and below the button. And just like a flower in nature, usually aesthetics are based on some form of a repetition. So I want to go with a repetition of space around the button. It takes up roughly the same amount of buttons. Now, if my buttons had mostly lowercase to them, then I'd probably concentrate on this distance here, which is known as the X height. But since every button starts with a cap and they're relatively short words, I'm going to focus more on this overall distance is occupied by the H. So one thing that I want to do is measure how big that is. How much space does that take up? It's not necessarily going to be 18 pixels because I chose an 18 pixel font. You'll learn that in your typography classes. And one real easy way to measure things in a lot of these programs is just to pretend like you're going to draw something. So if I come down here to this icon right here in the tools and just click and hold on it, I want to select from the flyout the rectangle tool. I don't really need a rectangle at this point, but I'm just going to pretend like I do. So I'm going to start right at the top of that H and click and drag, and what you see is this little smart box next to it tells me how big of a box I'm making. All I'm concerned about right now is the height of the box. So that H occupies 13 pixels. So I'm going to release the mouse, it's going to make that box, and I'm going to Command Z to get rid of it, and I'm going to write down 13 pixels. And in the next video, we'll continue on with making this button.